So, hey, me again for the last time, I promise. Yeah, this time with my API owner head on. So last summer, I was up on this mountain visiting this lovely glacier when all of a sudden I was high enough, like at a high enough elevation to actually get cell coverage from the town below. And at the time, I still had my Twitter notifications enabled because I was foolish. And all of a sudden, in the midst of all this tranquility and awe, Twitter decided Twitter decided to let me know that I have more or less 1 gazillion new mentions because the internet decided to have a fist fight and get me involved. This was around the intent to remove alert and various other APIs from third-party contexts, which has hit Chrome stable and which caught people by surprise, and they had strong opinions about that fact. People were starting to throw a bunch of conspiracy theories around, so against my better judgment, I replied with a thread outlining the motivation for this change, the fact that we had cross-browser consensus to actually make that change, admitting that some of the use cases were missed when we reviewed that, and then pointing out that the change was rolled back, etc. None of that really helped, and people weren't particularly happy. So what went wrong in this particular deprecation and removal? Multiple things. There were 2 major use cases that we kind of missed, which heavily relied on cross-origin iframes with alerts. One was the enterprise use case, which we knew we don't have the numbers for, but we kind of relied on enterprise policy as a crutch to save us there. And apparently there are a bunch of enterprise use cases where enterprise policy is not really the answer. There was also the educational use case, the JS bins of the world that were using essentially loading content in a cross-origin iframe to isolate it in terms of cookies and whatnot, and then letting developers run arbitrary content inside of that iframe where alert is heavily used there in order to teach people what what happens when you run scripts and the various an interactive breakpoint. We also, beyond those 2 points, we didn't really communicate this particular change all that well to the broader community. We could have done a better job there. This shipped without deprecation reports, which was not great, because even if developers were getting deprecation reports and collecting them and looking into that, they didn't get any notification ahead of time that this is coming. And finally, there were some tone issues in the discussions that ensued, but that's, beyond that, I think that there's a fundamental issues with our approach to deprecations. Our mental model on how developers can modify their sites to get them to where we want them to be is somewhat disconnected from reality in many cases. We release Chrome every month, and the time for us to get code, from writing code to having it be deployed, is relatively short. Some developers that we talked to after this, they have 6-month release cycles, and if you want to change something that is a minor change, just a header change or something similar, get them to sign up for a reverse origin trial or something along those lines, that can in some cases involve them like having to ship an off-cycle version, which requires them to talk to their thousands of customers and get them to opt into this off-cycle version. And like there are a lot of complexities involved in shipping software. A lot of that is around the enterprise, but not necessarily only in the enterprise. And developer teams like us, they have their OKRs, they have their planning for the year that is already made at the beginning of the year. And then we drop surprises on them along the way and say, oh, by the way, you have to do this kind of work. And it's not necessarily a lot of work, but it is work that they didn't plan to do, and we land that on their plates. And yeah, as we saw in the keynote 2 days ago, we had 25 removals this year. I'm guessing, I didn't look at what those are. I'm guessing a lot of them were relatively safe and relatively small, but I bet that some of them weren't. And this is a cost that the developer community bears. So how can we do better? I don't have any answers. This is really a setup for a discussion. But one thing I do believe can be extremely helpful is Deprecation Reports. This is a feature that I think is underutilized today. Not all Chromium developers are aware of that when going into deprecation, and that's on me partially. We need to make sure that Chromium developers are well aware of it, are using Deprecation Reports properly. At the same time, we also want to make sure that interested developers are listening to those deprecation reports. There are various services out there that start to collect them, whether dedicated ones or RUM providers also started to listen to them, which is a great development. And we want to make sure that as many developers as possible are getting those deprecation reports and are actually doing something with them. Then another idea that came up in follow-up discussions is a deprecation announcement channel. Right now on BlinkDev, there's a lot of chatter going on. If you only care about deprecations, monitoring BlinkDev is a lot of work. It seems appropriate for us to have some dedicated channel for deprecation announcement, maybe as a mailing list, maybe on GitHub, that would enable interested developers to keep tabs on what's coming and be less surprised by it. Better communication. We should make sure that for large deprecations, there are relevant blog posts or whatever means we can use to reach out to as many developers as we can to inform them that a change is coming and they will need to adapt. And we need to do that with enough time in advance for them to actually be able to plan for it. Another idea that came up, which is fashionable nowadays with Elon and his RPCs, but to essentially batch deprecations and have some sort of a deprecation milestone every few months where we would apply multiple deprecations at the same time and make sure that, make it easier for developers to pay attention to this particular milestone. This could be one way to go. At a TPAC discussion on this front, the idea of success/failure reporting API came up, where developers can tell us whether their sites broke, or alternatively can tell us whether a positive thing happened in terms of conversion metrics. So we would be able to experiment with deprecations and see if one of those metrics went in the wrong direction. As a result of a deprecation, that could be an indication that breakage is more meaningful than what we otherwise thought. at the same time, it won't necessarily help us with user populations that don't enable that kind of reporting. So if we will report those metrics in UMA and UKM, we will still not see the presumably enterprise constituency. So I'm not 100% sure that this is the right way to go, but it's an idea that came up. And finally, like maybe we can have some sort of a way, like right now, I don't know how many of y'all have actually ran deprecations, but up until now, I talked about the fact that they're painful for developers. They're also painful for Chromium developers, because if you're trying to drive the usage down and you don't really have any reasonable way to reach out to sites other than pinging random people on LinkedIn or trying to like reach out through various random channels. And UKM can give us specific origins for, at least for Google folks. But we don't know what to do with those origins once we have them. And if there was some standard way for sites to declare, this is our contact information for the team that's responsible to make sure that the site remains unbroken, that could be useful for us, assuming that developers will actually use that and assuming that those contacts remain valid. I don't know if that's viable, but it's an idea. And with that, let's talk. Thoughts?
Thank you for this talk. This, I think, is a very, very important topic. One question I have, which I think would benefit most engineers, is if there are opportunities to simplify what we do internally in the code when we do a deprecation so that we reduce the opportunities for forgetting to use deprecation reports or things like that. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
I think that we can. It used to be very simple. So essentially, the use counter for deprecations also sent out deprecation reports. That's still the case, but in order for those deprecation reports to be meaningful, due to some like the move from DevTool console logs to DevTool issues, now there are a bunch of hoops that people need to jump through. We should probably try to minimize the number of hoops and maybe eliminate them altogether. So that's a great point.
So from an owner's perspective, the deprecation I did a while ago was primarily use counter based. How do you feel owners could better incorporate feedback from the broader community and not just rely on use counters for running deprecations?
I think it's hard. If the use counters are very, very small, then this is like just relying on the use counters is probably reasonable. You can also have HTTP archive searches, GitHub searches, all that, but that doesn't give you any guarantee. I think that maybe we should have like better communication channels, and I don't know if the deprecation you're talking, like if that was something that's big enough for us to actually, have a blog post on and try to get feedback on. If like for very small things, it's a hard problem. I don't have any answers, but maybe getting more people on the deprecation reports train will, fish out the people that don't typically report metrics, but will report that, will tell you that, the thing that you're going to break is something that they are relying on.
Just to follow up, I mean, for mine, it was a lower stakes use case, I guess, mostly like around casting. But I think of cases where like it's something you do once a year, like pay a bill or do something legal wise that may not show up in use counters, but could still be very important. So how do you capture that?
That's a great question. I don't have any answers, unfortunately.
Right.
Josh.
No. Oh,
Oh, Josh raised hand.
okay.
Go ahead, Josh.
Sure. It sounds like the deprecation reports might help with this, but one sort of chicken and egg thing that we've run into, especially with deprecating storage APIs, is the API owners seem reluctant to have deprecation warnings until we're already at the point where usage has been driven down, which leads to, what are our options for driving usage down to the point where we can then actually announce the deprecation. I know, DevRel and many ways to do this, but I'm curious for your thoughts on how to improve things here.
Yeah, there is some tension here because we don't want to spam developers with, this is going away, we don't know when, and here's a list of other things, like other 20 things that we want to go away but don't know when. So we don't typically introduce deprecation warnings until we have a line of sight into when those deprecation warnings will actually be actionable and when we will be able to actually remove that feature. You're right that at the same time, this will also mean that we won't be sending out those, like we don't show those deprecations to developers. We don't send out those deprecation reports to interested folks that collect them. Yeah, I think that the best path there, if you have large, like if the UKM breakdown of your use counter is that there are several large sites that are that are responsible for most of that usage, that's the best lever to drive down the usage and talk to those sites directly. But again, this is easy when it's sites we have partnerships with. It's less easy when it's random sites on the internet that we need to figure out which is the right person to talk to there. Yeah, that's a great point. I have no good answers, sorry.
We have another one from the room.
Yeah, I don't really know if this is a question, but my team recently deprecated an API that met these, harder requirements where it's not used at law, but it was on the critical path for authentication and mostly on enterprise. So, we don't really get good data. And it was a very slow process. So I had this idea that ended up being rejected for some reason of making the API fail some % of the time and then show an error to the user. This site is trying to use something that is deprecated. Go talk to the maintainer. But they didn't like that for some reason. Yeah, and it took over a year, like a year and a half or so. So yeah, I understand your pain, is what I'm trying to say.
All right, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, first, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed this talk, actually. It's a really tricky question. I guess I have two comments. So, one is, I feel like the question that was asked earlier about, how can we involve the broader community? One answer to that might help. I mean, it's not an answer, but I also have been involved in several things that have tried to engage the community. And one that seems to be pretty useful is MDN now has the ability to run short surveys. We have interop and developer experience groups that are working on how do we look at that kind of data, like surveys and things. it would be good to engage that group, I think, with some of the things that we are thinking about maybe someday, just to like ask for input or gotchas or whatever. And the other comment is more of a question, I guess. You had mentioned something about like being able to register, like here are the people responsible for this in case something goes wrong. I also have made a suggestion to that would benefit from that. So I'm curious, like, has there been any discussion? Like the H2P archive collects gobs and gobs and gobs of data, and a lot of it you can sort of detect anomalies where there's like obvious problems. And for the markup chapter, for example, we looked at the data, we found some anomalies and discovered that like 10,000 sites were broken because of like one chunk of markup that somebody accidentally committed. And it was like, we tracked that person down, and that afternoon, like made 10,000 websites better. Like having a facility to do that, I agree, would be great, not just for deprecation notices, but all kinds of other things we could build with that. Has there been any like feedback or movement, or do you have any sense of how plausible that is?
Given that this is a slide I added at 2 a.m. tonight, I doubt it. Just, random idea. Let's run with it and see where it takes us. I agree that this would be useful for various things beyond deprecations. The main hurdle I see there is not in specifying and implementing this thing, but actually, having developers actually pay attention to this and provide us with a meaningful contact. Because it's easy to give you, a DevNull email address.
Yeah, I guess keeping it up to date too would probably be difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, going from the room.
Yeah, so you mentioned we don't want to spam developers with deprecation notices, but has there been some thought of maybe having different levels of deprecation warnings that the user could opt in, and maybe have like the info level for logs where you have everything, anything that anyone is thinking of deprecating, and then some more strictness in that?
That sounds like a reasonable thing to do. Thank you. I don't think we explored that. But that sounds like a good thing.
Riley, go ahead.
So Yoav, have you tried just not deprecating things? Because then you wouldn't break anybody's website. On a more serious note, though, I think, and like Dimitri added a comment in chat on this, like trying to create incentives for users to kind of follow and notice deprecations. I think some other browsers have like developer editions that sort of surface more developer-friendly features up front. And I think that we've also, in Chrome, we release every month. There's lots of opportunities for regressions to sneak in as much as we try not to. And so we've tried to get developers to use like beta channels so that they have that sort of time machine that can see into the future of what their users will be experiencing. So are there ways we could try to sort of incentivize the people who have the opportunity to change their sites to be sort of part of following, subscribing to that mailing list about upcoming deprecations, or using like Chrome Developer Edition, to try to really build that community outreach.
I think that would be useful, but yeah, to some extent, Canary and Beta are already serving that developer edition. It's true that we could also like surface more things in Canary and Beta than we surface in stable Chrome. The problem, though, at least in some cases, is like the reason why developers can't always test everything with Canary and Beta is that not everything is like some issues come up from the wild. Some issues are related to things that users are doing, or in cases of large platforms like Salesforce, who was heavily involved after this third-party alert thing. They have their customers who are writing their websites on top of their platform, and it's their customers that need to run those tests on their application logic. So it's not necessarily like, it's hard to have that kind of testing coverage beyond what users are, doing and then reporting breakage. And users will not use Beta or Canary.
So I think one idea I had listening to one of the questions was whether we could leverage kind of open source repositories like GitHub in some way, and maybe provide a GitHub action to let developers know that there's a deprecation coming up in some of their code, or even making GitHub part of their product to help give developers warnings. And then that would kind of catch a lot of open source code and open source frameworks.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think that it can like link into the announcement channel that people talked about. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Question would be, do you have some kind of high-level idea of how people are noticing deprecations nowadays? A kind of breakdown. Okay, they notice like by blog, by this the mailing list, BlinkDev, an event, something like that. Is there any kind of Chromium user, developer users poll that is giving that information? And if not, would it be, maybe that could be useful, kind of for the developer community using the frameworks or whatever, knowing at least where they notice this kind of changes, so the strategy can be adapted accordingly.
Yes, so I don't have any data. Typically, those kind of like breakage reports come in as like Chrome bugs, and which is like one thing that, one channel, it's a lay channel, but this is how we typically discover. Another is people come back to complain on BlinkDev, like on the intent thread. That's another one that we see once in a while.
So all of them are reacting already to the problem, and you don't get when the communication has been successful. So that maybe we want to know beforehand if we are communicating right the deprecations, and not only when there's the tragedy and the drama.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, with that. Thank you. Thanks so much.